that we monitor: inflation, growth, the external sector, but increasingly with concerns about financial stability. A lot of monitoring now also focuses on, what are the indicators of, possible indicators of crises. And so, for example, the IMF has all this data on macroeconomic vulnerability analysis. They look at 15, 20, 30 variables, and it's something that all governments and countries do as well. Now, of course, in the Indian context, I think we monitor how the exchange rate is behaving, how stock markets are behaving, but increasingly, and of course, it's very important to monitor how asset prices are moving, especially the exchange rate, land prices, equity prices, real estate prices. So these are all because a lot of crises relate to asset prices becoming overvalued, and they crash, and they bring a lot of trouble. But one particular indicator that I think is very, very important to monitor, or I would say there are two indicators that I think are very important to monitor to be careful about, which could imply or lead to crises down the road. One of them is capital inflows, and we'll do that to some extent later on. I showed you some. If you get a lot of money coming in, especially of the volatile variety, it could flow out very quickly, and that's what brings about a foreign exchange crisis or a currency crisis. But here's a chart. It's from the latest IMF Global Financial Stability Report. Before I do that, there's one. I think that when you're teaching, this whole monitoring the Indian economy, of course, you should recommend and use the survey. Of course, you must do that, and I'm sure you do that. But if there is one publication that I would say is very good to monitor international developments more broadly, it would be, in my view, the IMF's World Economic Outlook. They produce it twice a year, in April and October. And of course, they also now produce this for every region, including for the Asian region. They produce a regional economic outlook. That, I think, encapsulates in one form what's happening around the world, and in India and in the region as well. So that's, I think, a good. So this is a chart from that, and what it shows basically is that all the recent crises, Japan, Thailand, Spain, United States, seem to be preceded by a big run-up in private sector credit. Credit to GDP rises very sharply, and what happens is you get all kinds. Once the credit grows too rapidly, you get asset prices increasing very rapidly, and then the asset prices collapse, and then credit stops flowing, and then the real economy suffers as a result. Now, there's also a chart on, there's a line on China. China has also witnessed, I think, one of the biggest credit surges in recent time. That's a big indicator of vulnerability. And in the last economic survey, now it's a bit of an aside, we use this to actually, I don't know how many of you have seen this chart. It's something that we produced in the survey to argue that international ratings agencies were being very biased in their assessment of India and China. And what we, again, I want you to see this, again, not because we're right or wrong, but because this is the kind of things that I think we should be teaching our students. So, for example, if you were to ask me about a country, two indicators, one about, the real economy, and one about its financial vulnerability, probably the two I would pick are, real GDP growth and credit to GDP growth, which I just showed you has been is a kind of almost a leading indicator of potential vulnerabilities down the road. So what we did in the survey was to show that on these two indicators, India and China are actually almost completely opposite. Chinese growth has been slowing down, and that's the blue line, from very high levels. India's growth also slowed down but has started picking up again. So on this measure, India looks at least as good as China does. But on the other indicator, total social financing, which is the Chinese term for credit, look at it's gone up from, and deliberately we've done both on the same scale. Again, it was supposed to be the same scale, but it's not quite, but they're broadly the same scale. Again, we want to show that, look at both the level and the change in credit to GDP. Look at where China is and look at where India is. So India seems to be much less vulnerable than China, not just in level terms, but in change. And so what we argued was that despite these big differentials, the rating for India was BBB minus, and that's hidden there, and for China was AA minus. So 2 points, both the level ratings seem to be not completely consistent with the underlying economy, and also that for China, despite the slowing growth and the rising credit over time, the ratings agencies had not done anything. However, we are going to claim 100% credit for this, 700% credit, although it's not strictly true. A few months after this came out, and about a month ago, the ratings agencies downgraded China. At this point, I think, I was hoping to get applause. Maybe we should all stand up and sing Jana Gana Mana, but we won't do that. But basically, this is more seriously, this is kind of again a way of how to assess the economy and what indicators to look at. Having done all this, I'm not going to go through all this. So essentially, just a small aside. So every time we write the survey and we do macroeconomic overview, this is the first chapter in the survey, it's always, there's some things that we will do which are common to all assessments, what happened to growth, what happened to inflation, etc., etc. But what we focus on will be very different because it's going to be dependent on what's going on. For example, when we wrote the first survey, the big question was, is agricultural inflation coming down? And rural wages were coming down very sharply, which was very different from what happened from 2007 onwards. So we focused on this and said, well, maybe agricultural component of inflation is coming down structurally, and therefore inflation is going to be low going forward. That's something we focused on. Last year's survey was focused a little bit on China and on fiscal deficits. The year before, and this latest survey was on demonetization, which we'll come to in the last module. So these assessments will change, obviously will change depending upon the global economy, the domestic economy, and so on. So now is where we're going to do a kind of real life example. I'm not going to offer my opinion. So what is happening to recent economic trends and future outlook? So we know what the government decided in the latest budget. We know what the RBI decided in its latest budget. So let's see, supposing you were the policy maker and you had to decide on fiscal and monetary policy, how would you make the assessment? Not right, wrong, but how would you make the assessment? And so what we need to focus on is not just on recent trends, but also remember that we spoke yesterday that monetary policy works with a lag. Similarly, even fiscal policy works with a lag. You spend more, it's not as if the budget does something the next day, actually the expenditure is going to happen. It takes time, so it has to be a little bit forward looking. So any review, anything you want to see what's happened, but you also want to see what your best assessment is of the outlook going forward in order to decide, these two key areas of policy: fiscal policy and monetary policy, what we're going to do, what one should do. Again, well, we showed this yesterday. We're getting very unimaginative here. It's the same chart. It's like going forward, but looking at the rearview mirror, and you see there in the mirror, you see a storm. Outside, looking ahead, it's bright. But I think if we'd had a little bit more imagination, what we'd have done was, especially after having looked at the GDP, GVA data, you could say that maybe the speedometer is not, maybe we're driving at 50 and the speedometer is saying 20, or vice versa. Something we could have added. But so this is the metaphor for what policymakers have to do. We've done inflation, and we've looked at both headline and why we look at core and true core. But I think the point is that you have to know not just what's going to happen today, but what's going to happen 6, 9, 12 months down the line. So the question is, what are the external factors and the internal factors that will affect inflation going forward? So what are the things you look at? So one, of course, you must all be following, right? Every time before India's Monetary Policy Committee meets, or even before, we always say, what is the Fed going to do, the US Fed is going to do. And why do we look at that? We look at that for a number of reasons. We did this yesterday, right? If the Federal Reserve increases its interest rates, we saw that there will be, maybe pressures on capital to flow out. And therefore the exchange rate might depreciate, and therefore so it'll have two impacts. Maybe it'll make financial conditions in India more volatile, and that has implications for macroeconomic policy. Also, it might lead to actual capital going out. The exchange rate may be declining, which will have impacts going forward. So that's a key component of what. Now, what is interesting, of course, is that what actually happens from what you think is going to happen is actually, sometimes it can vary quite a bit. So just to give you an example, in December, when the US president came into power, Trump came to power, we thought, everyone said he's going to have, the Fed is going to increase its interest rates because the US economy is starting to do well. Everyone thought that, he's going to have an expansionary program. So everyone thought the combination of the two, you raise interest rates, you increase the deficit, everyone felt that US interest rates would go up quite sharply. And therefore there'd be huge capital outflows from all emerging markets, including India. So the fear was that the dollar would strengthen and the rupee would depreciate. It turns out, interestingly, over the last 4 or 5 months, exactly the opposite has happened. At least over the last 2 months, the dollar has depreciated significantly, and the rupee, as we just saw against both the dollar and against a basket of currencies, appreciate. So I think in all of this, we try and make the best assessments going forward, but we have to keep monitoring because they say stuff happens, things change quite a bit, and really. And then you look at one of the concrete things you look at is that if the exchange rate is going to decline, what is the impact on inflation? And then you look at studies. For example, there are studies by the RBI which shows every 1% that the rupee appreciates against the dollar, inflation will go up by whatever 0.1 percentage point. You have to look at a variety of studies to kind of assess what exactly is going to happen. You make a best guess, and then you see, well, that will then feed into your forecast, your forward-looking forecast of inflation, because if the rupee declines today, prices will go up again, not instantly, but with a lag, and then you have to know what the timing is going to be, and you have to do that. So that's another external factor that you would monitor. Now, what about oil prices? Now, here's something really very interesting, and this is something I really think that you should maybe again expose students to. We've always thought about oil as, so here's one very, I think, really important point about India, really important point about India, that, and in a sense, I showed you something yesterday, and I'll also show you something tomorrow, this afternoon, that's really very interesting. Remember yesterday when we did the fiscal charts, we had 2 episodes where the fiscal deficit went up and we had, it led to crises. In the 80s, fiscal deficits went up 91 we had a crisis. In the mid-2000s as well, deficit went up to 2013. We had this. We had a similar increase in the deficit leading up to 2002, but we did not have a crisis. And my explanation is that a big reason for that is in the 2 episodes where we did have a crisis, oil prices went up, and in the period when we didn't, oil prices were didn't change, and perhaps that's why we avoided. But it is absolutely true that the oil price is a major, one exogenous factor that has a crucial impact on India's macroeconomic stability. I'll take your question in 1 second. When you raised the question, I've lost my train of thought. I was going to say something about, I was going to say that actually before 91, we had another small crisis, a mini crisis in 1979-80, and that was, of course, again, the second oil shock happened. So oil prices have a really first-order effect on the Indian economy. So it is actually, therefore, very important to understand how oil markets, regardless of whether they're politically driven or not politically driven, but now the good news is that it's going to be less and less politically driven. So you have to understand the oil market. And here something has fundamentally changed about the oil market. So essentially the oil market, you think of it, I'm being very crudely generalizing, we think of it as a kind of pseudo cartel. The OPEC runs, determines how much to produce, and that can have an impact on oil prices. If OPEC decides to cut, prices go up. If OPEC decides to flood the market, so on. Now, within OPEC, of course, it's very complicated. There are OPEC countries and also non-OPEC countries which have a lot of oil. The UK was one of them. I think Russia is also another. That whole thing is very complicated. But also within OPEC, the country that really wields power is Saudi Arabia. Essentially what they say is that Saudi Arabia is a swing producer. It keeps a certain amount of excess capacity, and if it wants to flood the market, it uses that. If it wants to withdraw, it takes money away. So what this shows is that the yellow line is spare capacity inverted. That means if the line is going up, spare capacity is coming down, and what you see is that if before the yellow line, there's a very strong correlation between OPEC spare capacity, which is basically Saudi, and oil prices, where spare capacity goes down, oil prices go up. And vice versa, but thereafter, that correlation has kind of broken down, showing that OPEC now has less and less control over oil prices. The reason for that is actually what is a structural shift in the market for oil. What has happened in since about 2012 or 2011, around that time, something called hydraulic
within the rocks.
Fracking, hydraulic fracturing. That's called fracking. So essentially, you can drill these huge pipes and release the stuff that's stuck in between the rocks. So this is called shale gas and shale oil. So shale oil has become now the US from being a net importer now is gradually becoming a net exporter. So fundamentally, the oil market has changed in a way that has essentially what happens is that when oil prices go up, what you see in this chart is that oil rigs in the United States, they go up, and so when oil prices go up, supply comes on board, which brings oil prices down. When oil prices go down, oil rigs come down, and that stabilizes the market. So increasingly, and the difference between this kind of shale and the old oil is that this shale can be produced, it's like an accordion. If prices go up, you don't have to build the huge drills and everything. These things can be increased and decreased very quickly. So the oil market has become much less OPEC driven. And now the medium term forecast for oil is that oil prices are basically now capped about 50-55, which is the cost of shale oil production, because if prices go above that, shale oil will come on board. If prices go down, shale. Now, why is this important for an assessment going forward? Because essentially now it says that the inflation outlook for India from oil has become very, very different. You know, every document you read on India for the last 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, when they talk about the outlook, they will say geopolitical uncertainty in the oil market, very, very important. Geopolitical uncertainty, very, very important. And it's like, you know, in your sleep you can say it and, you know, and be considered a very deeply insightful person because you talk about geopolitical uncertainty. But I would argue that if you keep saying it again, you're a very uninsightful person and you haven't studied the oil market, because the oil market has structurally shifted, and which is in a way that is very, very good for Indian macroeconomics. In fact, the first survey that we wrote, you know, when I became CEA, we spoke about a sweet spot for the Indian economy, a number of things, you know, domestic. But one of the external factors that we noted was that, you know, oil prices were coming down and were going to remain down on a structural basis. So that's something. But again, this is something that students should know about, you know, about how oil markets have changed and how that changes the economic outlook. Sorry, you had a question.
So just to add on, when you were saying the crisis before impacted a lot compared to this time, do you think that India is also changing the composition of trade that we do of oil? So earlier we used to import a lot. Now over the period of time, we have started exporting.
Yeah. So the question. Yeah. So the question is whether the composition of our oil trade has changed over time. Actually, if you look at our exports, and this has been true for a long time, we've always exported a lot of oil. You know, and therefore, when you look at exports, for example, we should look only at non-oil exports, because in some ways, oil prices, they increase our imports, but they also increase our exports. So the net effect of oil is not what you see from the higher imports. And I don't think that has changed dramatically. It may have, but I think it will change dramatically either if we discover, you know, more gas or drill more thing, and, you know, but all that for the last many years, I don't think we've made major discoveries. You know, we had this big natural gas discovery, but as you know, that's gone nowhere in the Godavari basin. But basically, I think the oil market domestically has not changed as much as, you know, when we discovered Bombay High or whatever. You know, in those days it was very different. But the global oil market has changed quite substantially in a way that affects Indian macroeconomic outlook. Then when you look at inflation, you also look at domestic factors. You know, always, you know, what is the outlook for the monsoon? If the monsoon is going to be good, we know that, you know, agricultural prices are going to be soft, which is good for inflation. Now, there are also one-off factors that affect the you know, inflation outlook. So for example, this time around, very important to know what will be the impact of the GST on prices. Another one which again we had, I don't know why it's gone away, also the 7th pay commission is going to be implemented, and we know that this time around housing rent is going to go up, house rent allowances, so we have to factor that in. And then what we look at is, you know, okay, housing rent is going to go up, what fraction of CPI is housing, within that what fraction is rental, what is not, within that rental how much is government, how much is private. So you have to, you know, do this detailed analysis to see what the impact of housing will be, similarly in that. And then, you know, for example, in the latest RBI they raised the question also of, you know, two things they raised. They said, for example, the pulses thing, is it one-off? Because a lot of the decline in inflation, or some amount, is due to a dramatic reduction in pulses prices. So the question is, you know, what is going to happen? Will that decline remain? Will that be different going forward? And of course, then the monsoon becomes important. They also said, for example, what about loan waivers? So if states start giving loan waivers, how is that going to affect inflation? Is it going to inject demand into the economy? And so on. Now, one thing, a technical point I want to say is that in all these models that we do about how do you project inflation going forward, you know, exchange rate, monsoon, etc., etc. But in most of these models, inflation is determined by all these factors that I said, but also by what we call something called the output gap. It sounds very fancy, but it's actually quite simple. It is essentially saying that will the economy grow in a way that will make demand and supply, how will it force the demands, or how will it affect the demand-supply imbalance? Will the economy grow so rapidly that demand will exceed supply? Will it grow slowly so that demand and supply will be different? Remember, the reason why we're interested in this is if there is weak demand and supply is great, then the pricing power of firms is much less. So, so it's basically a buyer's market. If it's weak, it's a buyer's market. If the economy is overheating, it's a seller's market. So we are interested in this output gap, which is essentially demand to supply gap, because a key component, how much can producers and retailers pass on price increases, the power that they have, because pricing behavior is affected. So that's something that, and in order to do this, it's very complicated, very kind of fragile. You have to know what is the underlying supply capacity of the economy. You have to see where the economy will be going forward, and then you have to get a sense of demand and supply. But this is essentially, how you would look at inflation going forward. This is the inflation outlook, or the factors that would go into it. There could be other factors. Okay, here's a question for us. Can someone identify, say, something about the Indian economy, a factor that will affect inflation 6-9 months, which I haven't captured here?
Interest rate.
See, it's a good point, but in a sense, the reason why I hesitate is because we want to determine the choices, what interest rates need to be in order to, that will affect inflation. So it's a variable that you control. But surely you're absolutely right. If you, raise or change interest rates, that will affect both demand and prices going forward. But apart from that, will there be anything? Very good. So the one answer was what will happen to MSP, minimum support prices going forward. Very good point. In fact, in the run-up to the 2013 crisis and for that period, there's a lot of evidence showing that MSP increases had a critical role to play. But very good point. I think it's a very thing that we should keep in mind. And in fact, the government gets a lot of credit for what's happened to inflation because it has been very responsible in terms of how it's managed its agricultural prices, MSPs. But in that period when MSPs were causing inflation, what was happening also was that world agricultural prices were rising. So the MSPs were, so whether it was the MSPs per se or the MSPs tracking world prices is kind of an open question. But very good point, MSPs are, already have it, my friend. You're not looking. Seventh pay
commission, you already said.
Yeah, no, yes, I've said. I wanted something that I didn't say.
You did not say that.
Anyway, no, I've had one good answer. I don't want to. Yeah, maybe the gentleman there. Yeah.
Public work programs and its impact on the wages.
See, public work programs. Okay, let me tell you how I would. It's a very good answer. I would distinguish two components. One is, broader public investment, public spending deficit is going to be part of fiscal policy. But in that period, remember that period where we had high inflation, people said that Manrega, because of wage increases, that had a kind of independent impact on inflation over and above whatever was done through spending. So it is actually a good point. We have to look at what's going to happen to Manrega wages, for example, and that's another important determinant. Very good. So yeah, one last, and then because now there are too many hands. Now we have to move forward. Yeah.
I think besides these factors, India is also the largest recipient of remittances, particularly the private unrequited transfers. So these transfers, they created a lot of liquidity overhang, particularly in the post-reform era. So do you think that they will have an implication on inflation dynamics?
Brilliant question, excellent question.
FDI also.
Yeah, so let me give, I think it's a very good question. The way one should look at remittances from a macroeconomic point of view is the following. It's like other capital inflows. If you're going to get a lot of inflows or surges in inflows, that the predominant effect it will have is via the exchange rate. So for example, if you're getting a steady level of remittances, right, which we have, and then suddenly it shoots up or shoots down, yes, it will have. But we also have to look at magnitudes. For example, if I remember, remittances annually are broadly, $65 billion, around that, around 65, that's the steady amount. So if there are large departures from that, it could affect the exchange rate, and therefore it could affect inflation as well. Of course, remittances might have a local impact on Kerala inflation, Malayali inflation, Malayali house prices, Kerala house prices, but aggregate it'll happen via remittances.
Gold prices.
Huh?
Gold prices.
Yeah, gold price. Now you can get into. Now we're getting into dangerous territory of Malayali hidden secrets, the hidden secrets of Malayalis. We don't want to go there. Huh? We don't want to go there.
But FDI figures are also quite positive,
Yeah.
and that can have a huge impact on our inflation.
No, it have to be huge, changes for the exchange rate to be affected on that. Yeah.
But sir, good monsoon will also inject the demand from the farmer side.
Yeah. Now we're coming to that. Let's just come to that. No, my friends. Now it's dangerous to start asking you questions. Now you have too many questions. Okay, I think absolutely the last one by someone. No, I think that person hasn't asked a question. No, sorry. This gentleman here hasn't asked a question. So, you, yeah. So, I'm sorry, I should be calling you by name, but then I don't know your names. I'm sorry about that.
Sir, what about this growing non-performing assets of banks?
Yeah, let's. So that allows us to move into this. I've told you about the real sector. We've done the real sector. Now the question is, okay, a little bit. Just to finish. We look at credit. We look at investment. So now, just as we try to see what's going to be the inflation outlook, we also have to try and see what is going to be the growth outlook. And here's where I would say something that now, when we think analytically about the future, about growth, I think you should almost mostly look at it from a demand point of view. Why? I mean, see, there are two ways of projecting the future, right? You could say, oh, agriculture today is 5%, tomorrow I think it'll be 7% because of the monsoon. Manufacturing, steel sector is 6% today. But what do I know about how steel will behave? Construction, I don't know how steel, but I can try and relate some of the demand components to some of the factors that I know. So there is more of an analytical basis for projecting demand side. See, remember, in terms of the actual data, we look at the supply side and get supply. But in projecting forward, I would argue that it's easier to think analytically and within a consistent framework about what's going to happen to demand rather than what's going to happen to each of the sectors, with the exception, of course, of agriculture. Agriculture, as someone said here, just said, will go to. So one of the things we look at is how is kind of demand going to behave going forward. And here again, exports, we need to know what is going to happen to world GDP growth, and we need to know what's going to happen to the exchange rate. And then you say, well, and this is kind of some of the crude calculations that we do. We say, supposing for the coming year, world growth is going to be 3%. You can calculate what world growth is going to be based upon our export basket. Maybe that's 4%. And then we say, well, if world growth goes up by 4%, we have some numbers in terms of what the implications will be for Indian exports. You have these what's called elasticities. What is the elasticity of India's export growth with respect to world growth? You do that. Similarly, when you have the exchange rate, you say, we know that if the exchange rate strengthens by 10%, exports will come down by X%, imports will go up by Y%, and that's how you project this. Now, these are all fantastic ways of, pedagogically rich ways that can be mined, because you can actually give exercises like this. How do you project exports going forward? You have real effective exchange rate. What are the elasticities? Who's done the elasticity? And all kinds of very rich things you can do with the data with your students to say, okay, project India's GDP growth based on some of these factors. Now, the question that comes up this time around is, what will happen to consumption? Let's say consumption declined, in the aftermath of demonetization. Will it bounce back? How quickly will it bounce back? What are the factors that will make it bounce back? So one could think, for example, of saying, okay, what happened to cash before? What's going to happen to cash going forward? How does consumption relate to cash? And again, you could come up with an assessment of, how consumption demand is going to behave going forward. Then we come to, the question which is, all of you. I didn't quite, sorry, I should have also said, oh, yeah. There was also something that, because it relates to the question, the other thing we have to project is investment, right? Then you have to make an assessment of, is private investment going to pick up or not because of, what happens to credit and what happens to the twin balance sheet problem. So that's another indicator of that might determine what investment is going to be going forward, and that's something also we project. And then you have to look at which are the sectors in which there's a problem. Is credit going to flow to those sectors or not, and make assessments about investment behavior that way. The final thing, of course, is, all these are then inputs into what should be the stance of monetary policy, or fiscal policy and monetary policy. So, just to give an example, supposing you've done this exercise, supposing all of you have done this exercise, and you say, the economy's potential is going to be, let's say, 8%. And on the basis of this analysis, you say, let's say growth is going to be 7%. I'm making the number up. What would you advise on fiscal policy and monetary policy, and how would you think about that as well? So, in fiscal policy, what do we look at? We look at the deficit. We look at, for example, and here we have to be, careful. Do we look, because remember, the deficit is G minus T, and that injects demand into the economy, right? So we can look at, in this, when we do this analysis, you have to look at not just what's happening to the center, but what's happening to the states. Or you might say, supposing you wanted to say, what is going to be the impact of general government on private investment via, crowding out or crowding in? So, for example, you say if savings, remember we said savings are a certain amount. If government, captures some of that, how much will be left, and what will it do to, interest rates, especially GSEC rates, and therefore other policy rates as well. And so you may want to look at the chart on the right-hand side, your right-hand side. It includes also central public sector enterprises. So you want to look not just at the fiscal deficit of the state and the states and the center. You want to look at state, center, and general government, because then you can see if this is going to be what the government is going to borrow from the market. And then that can raise interest rates, reduce interest rates, depending upon how this is perceived in the market. So when you look at fiscal policy here, you should look not just at center, states, but perhaps even this, because then you say, well, this means that interest rates will go up by X, and that will have an impact on private investment. In addition, you might want to say, look, public investment, that was the question that was asked about public works. Could it be that public investment has a kind of special role in boosting demand? I mean, one thing to think of would be to say, see, what we have is that we say What are the multipliers? We say, look, the way we project, for example, what the impact of government spending will be on growth is you have these numbers saying if the deficit is X, we know that it will have either a one-to-one impact or maybe more than one-to-one impact depending upon multipliers. And then you could look at studies that show what is the multiplier. In Europe, there was a big debate in the aftermath of the Greek crisis when the pessimists said, oh, it's only one, and then a series of papers, including by Olivier Blanchard, said maybe the multiplier is 1.5, so that for every 1 rupee of deficit, you can get 1.5 rupees worth of activity. So that's the number we look at. But then you can say, well, not all spending is the same. A public investment could have larger multiplier effects than other forms of spending, and then you can calculate that as well. So that's another way in which the outlook will depend upon both the magnitude of the deficit and the composition of that spending as well. More public investment could mean more demand, and so on. And again, great pedagogical opportunities. You could say, okay, students, deficit is going to go up by X. What is going to be the impact on the economy? What are the factors that's going to impact that? Is a kind of exercise that you could do. You could say, go out and find what the studies say on what the multipliers are. Are they the same for current spending, tax reductions, and tax increases? So it could be that taxes, spending, and within spending, different forms of spending have different effects on the economy, and then that's what you'd have to do.
In the previous slide, Uday is excluded because it is stock, not flow.
Very good point. Exactly. Exactly. So why is Uday excluded? It's basically Uday is. It's basically a stock transfer. A bad asset becomes a loan. Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. Very good point. And then, of course, finally, I don't know what, if you were Mr. Arun Jaitley, what you will decide about the economy in terms of what fiscal deficit should be. Now, if you're the Monetary Policy Committee of the RBI, what would you decide based on this? And then, there are various ways of assessing what the current stance of policy is. One thing would be to say, what is the nominal rate and what is inflation, and therefore what is the real policy rate? Now, there are many, so this is one indicator, and there are many ways you could add on to this. You could say, for example, in this calculation, because remember, one way of thinking about this is, supposing there is a kind of neutral real policy rate, that's the rate at which the economy is in equilibrium. Let's say inflation is 4.5, you're happy with it, growth is whatever, 7.5, close to your potential. What should be the real policy rate when the economy is in equilibrium? That is the neutral rate. Then you say, well, what is it today? Is it, because the logic is that if the economy is weak, you want the real policy rate to be below to inject demand. If the economy is overheating, you want it to be higher to choke off demand. And then so you could make this calculation of the real policy repo rate. But then the question is that what inflation rate do you use? Do you use today's rate, inflation rate, or 12-month ahead inflation rate? Because that's what's going to determine, I borrow today based on how much I have to repay tomorrow. So that would be the interest rate that you want to do. You could complicate this even further. You could say that, look, the monetary stance in an economy depends not just upon the real interest rate, but also upon the exchange rate. Because remember, this affects domestic spending, consumption and investment. You may want to know what happens to foreign spending on our goods, on exports, and so you may want to factor in exchange rate. So there is something called a monetary conditions index where you combine the interest rate and the exchange rate to determine what the stance of policy is. Because remember, to some extent, interest rates and exchange rates are correlated. So if you change interest rates, you're also going to change exchange rates, and therefore that's going to determine the stance of monetary policy. You could get even more fancy, and then, in fact, yesterday, I don't know whether there was an article in Live Mint, there's something called the Taylor rule. The Taylor rule, which says what should be the interest rate based on your assessment of your inflation forecast, what is the natural rate in the economy, where the economy is expected to be. So these are all sophisticated calculations you have to make. But broadly, what I wanted to convey to you was, how do we monitor the economy? What are the indicators we use? How do we project this going forward? What are the factors that determine these things going forward? And based on that, how should fiscal and monetary policy react? These are the questions. So in the case of fiscal policy, for example, as we discussed yesterday, it could be that your assessment is that the economy is going to be weak, private investment is going to be weak. So you should say, well, then therefore the deficit should go up, public investment should go up. But then we said there are also these other considerations about, credibility. What will people think if we spend too much? What will happen to our debt trajectory? All of these things. So macroeconomic analysis and assessment is very, very, I think quite. So let me end by saying, making a slightly controversial statement. I made a speech about a month and a half ago called the VKR Virav Memorial Lectures, where, whatever, I don't want to go into what I said there, very controversial stuff. But the point I made was that actually macroeconomics is really hard. Writing intelligently about macroeconomics is really hard because, as you can see, it's for one actually very simple reason. If you write about fertilizer policy, it's relatively easy. If you write about what India should do at the WTO, it's relatively easy. You're basically dealing with one market, and then you have to. In macroeconomics, essentially, you are dealing at a conceptual level simultaneously with 4 markets and the interactions between them. First, you have the market for goods. That's the supply and demand that I told you about. Then you have the market for money, which is the interest rate. Then you have the market for bonds, the long-term rates. And then you have the market for foreign exchange, which is the exchange rate. So you have 4 markets interacting in very complicated and rich ways, and interacting in different circumstances and in different countries in different ways. And that's why I said that the quality of macroeconomic commentary in India, part of it is a problem because it's difficult to get people to think independently on this without being without keeping one eye on what the official authorities are going to say about what I write. But I think intrinsically it's much harder because there are many, many more things. And that's why I think for students in particular, it's very difficult to say, oh, interest rate goes up, this goes down, anything can happen, etc., etc. And your job as teachers should be to give them a framework for thinking about this. What happened, what's going to happen, what does it depend on, and how should you think about it? It's very hard, it's not easy, but that's what I think we should aim at when we teach our students macroeconomics. Now the floor is open to 5 to 7 minutes of questions. Wow. Okay. Sorry. I thought I could head for lunch, but no.
No, just very small.
Yeah.
You can choose to say it's controversial, but just asking my own perspective. If you look at the data of US and some other developed countries on which they base their policies, the Taylor rule you just mentioned, right? They use very frequently to say if the policy is hawkish or dovish, they use very frequently. If you place on a scale of 0 to 1, US data and the way it's collected, disseminated and publicly made available, at 1, where are we right now?
So the question is, if on a scale of 0 to 1, US data is 1, data quality and quantity, what is Indian data?
Please do answer.
And I'm going to give a cheeky but a true answer. My answer is going to be that if you compare American development and Indian development, that discrepancy is much greater than the discrepancy in the quality of our data. So Always relative to what? It's always relative to what?
Like a true economist.
Yeah. Okay.
But I think
No, I think there are people at the... Okay, please.
Just to
Yeah.
add on to the potential to improve upon, upon data availability is quite substantial because we are one of the good data, collecting
IT is very strong.
country.
So can I say? Can I say one thing? I think it's a good question, but see, here's the thing, right? If you look at the amount of high quality research that's done on Indian development issues, I would say there is so much more done on Indian development issues than on others. Not just because India is not as developed. After all, the more less developed you are, the richer it is. No, but even apart from that, because of the amount of data that we have relative to other developing and emerging market countries, I think that in terms of Indian data, I think, for example, one of the areas where I think we need to do much more, and in fact recently a committee has been set up under Dr. Arvind Panagaria, which is going to give a report. I think employment data is a place where, I don't understand enough the Indian economy, partly because I think employment data we could and should be collecting more. And in fact, we've started doing that. I think we're going to get a report soon, and that's an area I think which we should certainly work on. Yeah, at the back there.
Sir, my question is, I may be wrong, but it's my observation that in the 2004 and in 2009 election, the government spending on a public work program like a Narega and Manarega, and that lot of huge amount was spent, and that was not gone in the pocket of poor people, but maybe corruptions. But during that period, I have seen that land prices increases. So it's an analysis. I'm asking whether it is true or not, because I have seen that land prices increasing during that period. Those who got a lot of money, maybe 6th pay commission and Manarega and Narega amount. So is it?
So let me answer your question. It's a good question. Obviously, I'm not going to give you an answer on this. But it's a very good point. I'll tell you, it's a very good point. Some friends of mine actually have done some research to see how much spending happens on sand in advance of elections, because sand is a proxy for construction, and if you think a lot of election money is related to construction, then sand is a very good indicator of that. So certainly there have been people who think there is a connection between land, spending on land, and political cycles as well. But so you should go and look at that research. Yeah, next question. This was from the back. Anyone from the back? My northern friends. Yeah, both of you have asked questions. Northern friends, any of my northeast, northwest friends? No? Okay, unfortunately then we have to come down to the south or the center. We have the center there. Come. Yeah.
What is the impact of this infrastructure? Basically the road sector investment. Basically huge investment is underway in this sector.
Yeah, so I think that one interesting question is that clearly public investment is going to have huge consequences. Remember, with public investment, one has an immediate demand impact, but public investment builds capacity and increases the supply potential of the economy. So, I mean, just to give you, for example, there's work been done on Pradhan Mantri Gram Sadak Yojana. Impacts are huge on local economies. And they say about the United States that basically it's when President Eisenhower built the massive roads, that's when, that had a lot to do with US prosperity. The question there.
I was wondering whether we can get...
My friend here is very silent today. I'm I'm getting a bit anxious here. I'm not engaging his attention.
I just wanted to find out if we want to work it on this GVA manufacturing and the other old IAP or new IAP cities, if we want to go back to the previous years, can we think of, is it possible to get any kind of data? Because it is well established that based on ASA data that GVA to GVO has been declining over the time, historically. So that is our reason. I come from CDS. So how do we go about it? And then secondly, can we get this GVA or whatever index we have made, can we get across industries?
Okay, GVA data across industries is certainly available, right? I mean, we have, I don't know at what degree.
This new the series which you are talking about, IAP new.
No, the IIP should also be available. It's available online, right? Till 16, yeah. Sorry. Till 16.
That is available, but then if we want to do it across this based on this new data series, can we compare it?
Sorry, compare GVA and IIP.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think IIP is also available. New IIP.
New IAP.
Sorry, Anthony? No, but no, they know that, but they still want to make the comparison. How far back it's available for the same period of time, or rather, IIP new goes back to when?
That's the question.
Huh? 12. So the IIP new series starts in 2012. So you can certainly do it going backwards until then. Okay. I think that. Okay. One last question, and then we'll stop.
It is about US. So sometimes this thought just come to my mind. I just wanted to share with you that I feel that Fed sometimes, I mean, has not behaved responsibly. I mean, I have huge regards for RBI, but not for Federal Reserve. When we had this subprime crisis,
Are you seriously expecting me to comment on that?
No, please. So, when we had this subprime crisis, I mean, they were reducing the rates, and I always wonder that what was their economic think tank doing at that time, and they knew that if they're going to flood the banks with the, funds, of course they are going to look for different ways to go for prime and subprime loans. And Paul Krugman at that time was saying that it is a bubble, but nobody listened to him. So what is your take on that?
So, okay, so I'm not, so in fact, all of you should come back for the next session, because I'm going to be grading, all these central bankers. Who is going to get an F? Who is going to get A+? And why? Wait till 3:30. See you then. Okay, bye. No, 3:30 is when we talk about that. You should be back at 2 o'clock, right? 2 o'clock, sharp 2 o'clock. But that's a